New York University. She currently lives and writes in Massachusetts. Helen?
Good evening. Thank you so much. Hello, Michigan. Erev Tov, Dobry Večer. A big shout out to my friends Charlie Silo and Eva Kraus in Detroit. They are the people who first welcomed me at the second generation Chaim. So I would like to say thanks again for them. And I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. Let me start out by telling you that I am wearing a turban because unfortunately I'm in the middle of chemotherapy for cancer. And it is a difficult time to be having chemotherapy, but I'm not sure it's so much more difficult for me than it is for the rest of you during this time. At any rate, I find that I'm speaking about and reading from my mother's war memoir during this time, and it's an inspiration for really getting through it. My mother's memoir, Franci's War, was written in the early 1970s, but it was rejected by all the publishers to whom it was sent out. It was only published in the United States and in the United Kingdom this past spring by Penguin. It's also being published in Czech, Slovak, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Russian translation. The story of how and why it came to be published is interesting also, but first let's get to the memoir itself. The book is the survival memoir of a secular Czech Jewish woman, and it begins in Prague, where Franci Rabinek-Epstein was born in 1920. The German army invaded Prague in 1939, just after she turned 19. In 1942, she was deported to the camp of Theresienstadt, or as Czechs call it, Terezín. From there, she was transported to Auschwitz, then to the forced labor camps of Neuengamme in Hamburg, then to Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated by the British Army. The book ends with her return to Prague that fall of 1945. To give you a sense of her style, I'm going to read you from the very beginning. She began her book like this. It was a hot day in the first week of September 1942, and the industrial palace of Prague was teeming with people. Most were sitting on the loose straw on the floor. Others were wandering around in a stunned daze. I had often come to the industrial palace when I was a child, and my father's electrotechnical firm had a booth there. I returned home with free samples, balloons, and stacks of glossy catalogs. This time, the industrial palace had been converted to the assembly point for the deportation of Jews by edict of the Nuremberg race laws. I was 22 years old, and I had just had a tonsillectomy. I had not eaten for a few days. My mother kept stroking my hair and trying to make me drink a little water. My father was walking around from one acquaintance to another, hoping to find out what was in store for us. When they told me in the hospital that my parents and I had been called up for a transport, the nurse, who was a friend of ours, said, "We can get you out of it because of the surgery." I thought this over for a few minutes, and then I said, "I'm not letting them go alone. They're too old, and they don't have anybody else." My mother was then 60, and my father was 65. I couldn't visualize these two people going alone anywhere. And there was a little egotistical motivation too. My husband was already gone. I would have been left all alone in Prague. Besides, by September 1942, I was so fed up with all the restrictions that I thought any change of scene would be a relief, no matter what was waiting on the other end. I was always like that, unfortunately. So that gives you a very clear idea of my mother's tone throughout the book. She was then a young, independent, and very well-educated businesswoman who ran a fashion salon in the center of Prague. She had an interesting clientele there, as she later had in New York. It consisted of actresses, opera singers, wives and mistresses of rich men. Like many of us today, she took her civil rights for granted. Czechoslovakia was a multicultural country, and she had grown up as a privileged child, speaking Czech and German and being sent to French schools. Every spring and fall, Franci traveled with her mother to fashion shows in Berlin and Paris. She was in Berlin during the summer of 1936 and so focused on the clothes that she barely noticed the Nazis. In February of 1938, just before the Nazis annexed Austria, she had been skiing in the Austrian Alps. When she got back to Prague, she took over the ownership of the fashion salon. And during the Nazi occupation of Prague, her business was Aryanized, and she worked there illegally for almost 3 years. Her memoir was at least the 5th version of her experiences during the Holocaust, which is one reason that it reads so polished. She wrote the first version while she was still a prisoner in the Nazi slave labor camp in Neuengamme in 1944. There she stole a notebook and kept a diary in the form of letters to her mother. After a guard discovered it, she was forced by the camp commandant to burn it page by page in his stove. In New York City in 1955, my mother retold many of her experiences to a Central Park West psychoanalyst. In the 1960s, she told them yet again to a hostile reparations lawyer for the German government. In 1974, I interviewed her for the American Jewish Committee's collection of Holocaust survivor audio testimonies in the United States, which you can now find at the New York Public Library. Many readers are amazed at the specificity of Franci's memories. How could she remember things in such detail? My editors asked me. Many of us, I told them, are familiar with the vividness of traumatic memory. We also know that many survivors stayed in close touch with each other and recounted the events of the war to one another over and over again, as well as over and over again to their children. In my own case, nothing I read in my mother's memoir was news to me. I had heard all of it before. I had heard some of the episodes many times. In fact, it was my familiarity with this text that for a long time blinded me to its importance. One of the most interesting parts of the memoir takes place in Auschwitz. Many of the interesting parts of the memoir take place in Auschwitz. After she is tattooed in Auschwitz, she refers to herself not as Franci, but as the number A4116, which is her tattoo. Some readers find this an ingenious literary device. Franci herself learned during her psychoanalysis in the 1950s about the psychological defense mechanism of dissociation or splitting that comes into play sometimes during trauma. Her description of the process is characteristically simple and specific, and I'm going to read you from this passage where she moves from being Franci and thinking of herself as Franci to thinking of herself as this number. This comes from the middle of her memoir. And to set it up, her younger, flightier cousin and her close friend, Kitty, has preceded her from Terezin to Auschwitz. And she is already there when my mother arrives in the spring of 1944. She describes how she is quarantined and tattooed, and then she describes what happens with Kitty. Kitty came running into the barrack as soon as quarantine was lifted. Why did you come here? You fool, don't you know we're all going to be burned June 20th? The only reason why we from December are still alive is that the bastards want a nice round number for the operation, and there weren't enough of us left from March. Don't you know that to commemorate Masaryk's birthday, they sent 3,750 young people up the chimney? The March transport was brought in to replace them. Nobody leaves here alive. The limit is 6 months and no more. Why on earth did you have to come? I sat there, convinced that Kitty had gone raving mad. This could not possibly be my lifelong pal, the social butterfly with beautiful dark eyes that always smiled, even when she was serious. Now her eyes could not hold still, even for a moment. They shifted back and forth while she blurted out this totally irrational nonsense. A very strange sensation took hold of me then. I stared down at my tattooed arm, and like a badly focused picture in a camera, it slowly detached itself and became two arms. But only one of the arms had a tattoo. I tried to focus back, but the movement continued until there were two of us, me and A4116. I thought, what's she doing here, poor devil? I know her. I'm sorry for her. I'll watch her. She looks just like me. Listen to me, said Kitty again. I can see by your face that you don't believe one word I said. Come out and I'll show you. A4116 climbed down from her bunk and followed Kitty out into the camp. There in the distance, Kitty showed her a group of chimneys spewing smoke into the sky. And for the first time since her arrival, she became conscious of a peculiar odor in the air, like burning hair or bones. Still incredulous, A4116 said, but all this is quite impossible. Anyway, how do you know? This is a big camp, and they might just be burning corpses of people who died a natural death. You know how Germans are about cleanliness. Besides, there are enough old and sick people around here to keep a crematorium busy. Oh yeah, said Kitty. Then how do you explain that 3,750 people disappeared overnight? They could have been deported somewhere else. This is 1944. There are laws. Oh, you're so naive. The world doesn't give a hoot what happens to us here. For all we know, they might not even believe it if they saw it. Just like you. What about your capo, Nina? Why do you think she stayed alive and with her mother at that? That boyfriend of hers went through all kinds of trouble to stash them away because he knew what was up. Go ask her. That's the end of that extract. My mother wrote about women's relationships in the camps, like Nina's, her capo's relationship with her boyfriend, who was a criminal named Heine. She wrote about women's relationships in the camps with a non-judgmental attitude that came from her experiences with customers in the salon. She observed all kinds of relationships and all kinds of love in both places. Love between mothers and daughters, love between sisters and cousins, between friends, between heterosexuals, homosexuals, lovers for life, or lovers for the moment. She also wrote about love for one's culture and country and love for life itself. In 1975, that candor might have been the reason no publisher accepted her memoir. By 2018, the world had caught up with her. Books and television shows like Orange is the New Black lifted the curtain on relationships between women in prison. In academia, women's studies and Holocaust studies were delving into the experiences of women in war, and queer historians were sifting sources for documents of gays. The Me Too movement was providing a vocabulary for an international conversation about the connections between sex and power. During these days of racist violence and the COVID epidemic, Franci's War can be read as a survival guide. How did she survive? She refused to take her situation personally, but saw herself as part of a group. She kept alert, reading situations and people as best she could and acting accordingly. She kept her friends very close, formed alliances where she could, and volunteered to take care of others, including a young orphan named Gisela, whom she adopted while in Terezin and Auschwitz. One of the things we can talk about during the question period is how I wound up identifying all these people through the Jewish genealogy Facebook group. Somebody sent me photographs of the orphan Gisela, whom she adopted in Terezin and who was murdered in Auschwitz. My mother tried to find meaning in performing work she knew how to do, making and repairing clothing, both as the forced labor she was assigned to perform and for favors and food. She also took a great risk when being selected for work camp, and when asked by Dr. Mengele during a selection what her profession was, she lied, thinking there were too many dressmakers, and claimed that she was an electrician. She wound up working through the winter of 1945 as an electrician, fixing wires. She sought solace in memories of her parents, of her first great love, of favorite poems, songs, and music. She took one day at a time and clung to the conviction that she would get through whatever happened. Franci often referred to the concentration camps as her university, where she had received a unique education in human behavior. She also lost her entire family, her husband and her two parents. Her greatest concern was that due to human nature, what happened to her could happen again in a different form to anyone, anywhere in the world, even here in America. She left that conviction as a legacy to her three children, and I'm finding it very helpful now as I'm navigating cancer and chemotherapy through COVID. And I'll be happy to take the rest of the time to answer your questions. So thank you, and let's get to it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ruth Bergman, the Director of Education for the Holocaust Memorial Center. I read Franci's War and it touched my heart. It's impossible to understand the magnitude of the horror that Franci faced or the resilience and the courage it took to survive and build a new life for herself. We're going to take some questions from the audience. Please type the questions that you have into the Q&A tab located at the bottom of your screen. We've had a lot of thoughtful questions submitted and we won't be able to get to all of them. I do want to ask the first question though. Helen, you talked about the theme of identity in your mother's work, and you touched upon the fact that she started to refer to herself in the third person when she was in Auschwitz and didn't return to describing herself in the first person until after the war. But she was baptized to Catholic, asked to have her papers changed to without religious affiliation when she was older, and then of course marked as a Jew by the Nazis. Could you talk about her sense of identity and how she saw herself?
Sure. Czech Jews are quite typically like my mother. You all remember the huge fuss that was made about Madeleine Albright when she discovered that she had all of these grandparents who had been deported during the Second World War, and nobody believed her. Well, that's very typical of Czech Jews. Not Slovak Jews as much, but certainly Bohemian Jews. And my mother was very much like that. My grandfather was the one who first had himself baptized. Even though his name was Rabinek, which in Czech means little rabbi. He didn't change his name, but he was very, very annoyed that he didn't get into the German universities he wanted to get into. He was convinced that it was because there was an anti-Jewish quota, and he thought if he had himself baptized, that he would circumvent that, just like Mahler did to become the director of the Vienna Opera and any number of other people. When he married my grandmother, I just discovered this recently. I didn't know this. My brother, David, the family genealogist, discovered that right before he married my grandmother, he insisted that my grandmother get baptized. So both my grandparents were baptized. And so naturally, when they had my mother, they had her baptized and all of this was completely opportunistic. They felt that this was to get ahead in society, as so many Viennese, Hungarian, Czech, and German Jews did at that time. And my mother never took it seriously. She didn't have much of a Jewish identity, however, because her grandparents were dead, and her father's closest relatives lived in Vienna, and they had all converted. The entire Viennese branch of the family had converted. So that was her situation. And she really became Jewish in the concentration camps. That was the first time that she really came to grips with all kinds of things about being Jewish, as well as, basic Jewish calendar, Jewish holidays, Jewish teachings. All of that she learned in the camps. And then when she came to the United States, of course, she insisted that her kids go to Sunday school. So we taught her a little bit.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So one of the questions that we have here is, why did your mother encounter so much hostility from the reparations lawyer?
I think many people encountered a lot of hostility from the reparations lawyer. The reparations lawyer were working for the German government. They weren't working for the survivors. And it was their job to make things as difficult as possible for them. And my mother had a roof fall on her back in Neuengamme, in the place where she was an electrician. And she clearly should have had medical reparations for her back, and they refused to give them to her.
Oh, wow. So you say that your mother talked about her stories and you were familiar with them. She was not, I know there are many survivors who never talked about their experiences, but your mother did. Did you know about the book as she was writing it? Did it have an impact on your family and family conversations? Was it something that she did privately? Can you tell us about that experience?
We had absolutely no idea she had written a book until after she had died. I have two brothers. Neither my two brothers nor I had a clue. We never found any manuscripts. We never found any notes. The manuscript was typed on onion skin paper in English. My mother spoke 4 languages very well. She was a voracious reader. And even though she had no aspirations to be a writer, she wrote very well. She wrote exactly the way she talked. And she talked a lot. I mean, she, as a dress designer, she was talking all day to her customers and listening to them all day. And they all spoke excellent English. So I think that accounts for why her book is so well written.
So I want to talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned in the book that in the 1970s, your mother gave you a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
After it was rejected by all these publishers.
Right. And you said there, and I'm quoting, "I wanted to get away from it, not into it."
Right.
And like many children of survivors, and I'm also one, so I understand, you said that you needed to separate what was mine from what was hers.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit and explain what you mean and why that's an issue for so many children of survivors?
Well, I think many survivor families are like islands. There are so few people left. In our case, my father was the only surviving member of his family, and my mother was the only surviving member of her family. So the 2 of them and the 3 of us kids were a nuclear family. And we did everything together. And unlike the American paradigm, where at adolescence, the child breaks away or rebels or distances him or herself or moves to another area, that didn't happen with us. Now, in my particular case, I look exactly like my mother. If you look at the cover of my mother's book and look at me, I mean, you can't tell right now because I have no hair, but when I have hair, I look very much like my mother. And so in addition to all of the forces that were pushing us together and not allowing us to separate in the way most American kids separate. And I would say also in immigrant groups, this also is something of an issue. In many Asian or in all kinds of immigrant groups, it just doesn't happen that this American paradigm of rebellion and separation at adolescence happens. It doesn't happen everywhere. So in our case, it didn't happen. And on top of that, my mother and I were temperamentally and culturally very, very close. We were the family intellectuals, we were the readers, we were the theater goers, we were the music lovers, we were the opera goers. You know, my mother didn't go to the opera with my father, she went with me. She went to the theater with me. She went to concerts with me. So all of that reinforced this incredible closeness. And it was very, very, very hard to disentangle myself from it. And when I became a writer, which was, I went to journalism. I became a writer as your CEO said, during the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. I got stuck there and I wound up writing an article that wound up being published in the Jerusalem Post. And so once I started writing, I definitely was separate professionally. But of course, just like any other New York mom, my mother was utterly thrilled that I was a journalist, and she got even more thrilled when I started writing for the New York Times. And so that did not help us separate. That glommed us together even more. And I think it was easier for my brothers, certainly my middle brother, to separate because I was there. I was taking care of my mother, so he could go off and do what he wanted to. And then I have a brother who's 12 years younger than I am. So it was a little easier for him too. But I think this paradigm of closeness and the difficulty of separating is true for all survivors, because for so many of our parents, separation meant death. And it was very, very hard to separate or to display loyalty to friends or to choose friends over family, or even, to go away overnight. There are families where the kids didn't go away overnight. They had to stay at home. We at least went on sleepover dates.
So thank you. And on that note, a few people wanted to know how your mother's Holocaust experiences affected you and your worldview, and how you see what's happening in the world today.
Well, that's a lot of different questions. Where do you want me to start? How they
anywhere you want. So, people want to know.
I think, well, let me tell you where I grew up, because I think where all of us grow up is a huge factor in this, not only in terms of neighborhood, but in terms of country. If you grow up in Tel Aviv, or if you grew up in Tel Aviv in the 1950s, or if you grew up in Crown Heights in the 1950s, or if you grew up in Detroit in the 1950s, or if you grew up in Montreal in the 1950s, or if you grew up in Atlanta in the 1950s, those were all very, very different places to grow up. The other thing, of course, was what kind of experience did your parents have during the war? I mean, in my case, my father did not have a tattoo. My father was in Auschwitz only for 2 days, but my mother had this Auschwitz tattoo. And because she worked at home and because she worked with her sleeves rolled up, it was always visible. There was no way not to see it. And a lot of her friends also had Auschwitz tattoos. And a lot of people in New York had Auschwitz tattoos in Manhattan. So it was very much a part of my life. I did not like the tattoos. I hated the tattoos. I thought that they were like branded, like cattle being branded. And I found them really, really disturbing. I didn't like looking at them. On the other hand, I knew that there was nothing to be done about them. I knew that some of my mother's friends had had them removed, and that was even worse because they had this kind of pale rectangle of skin where the tattoos were. So the tattoo was a very big deal. The other thing was there were behavioral components to having parents who were survivors. And again, let me say there are many very different kinds of survivors. I know kids of survivors whose parents were in hiding, and their hiding behavior certainly has translated down to the second generation. They're very cautious, they're very secretive, they don't make a lot of noise. There are all of these things that have to do with their parents' hiding experiences. There are other people I know whose parents were partisans and who were Warsaw Ghetto survivors, and who worked, there are other survivors who worked with the RAF during the war, and then afterwards went back to Czechoslovakia again. So you have all these different varieties of experiences. But in terms of my parents' experience, the experience of having been in concentration camp and of having had all 4 of my grandparents murdered. I mean, 2 of them were shot into an open pit and 2 of them were gassed. But all of them were murdered. And this is something I grew up with that was extremely difficult to deal with, especially since I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York, which had a kind of normal American Jewish community, and almost everybody had grandparents. And one of the things that bothered me most about all of this stuff, certainly as much as the tattoo, was that I didn't have grandparents. At the end of school, grandparents would turn up. when there was Mother's Day or when there was some kind of holiday, you'd make gifts for your grandparents. And I had none. And I wound up asking my nanny, my Czech nanny, to pretend she was my grandmother so I would have a grandmother.
Wow. Wow. So some of the participants, some of the audience would like to know how your parents met and a little bit about their life together.
My parents actually, my father was 16 years older than my mother. And the first time they met, my father was 29 years old and he was a swim coach at a very famous swim club in Prague. And my mother was 13 and she was in the pool and she was swimming laps. And my father was known, my father was a bachelor. He married very late. And my father was known as an extremely stern coach. You didn't fool around with Epstein. He just would make you swim more laps. And so she didn't think much of him. She thought he was kind of a prig. And she had nothing really to do with him. She was 13. And then my mother married someone else. My father was involved with somebody for a very long time. Both of their partners were murdered in the war. And they met on the street in Prague in 1946. It was spring, or it was almost summer. And my father, after he had returned from, I didn't say, sorry. So in addition to being a swim coach, my father was an Olympic water polo player. And that's really how he spent his life. He was a jock. And when he returned from the camps, most of his teammates had survived the war. They were not Jewish. They welcomed him back, and they welcomed him back to his swim club. And he resumed swimming and playing water polo. So he was walking down the street in Prague and he saw my mother and they sort of recognized each other. And he said, "How come I haven't seen you at the swim club?" And she said, "Well, I haven't gotten the chance to get there." And so they went to the swim club and that's how they got together again.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So your mother had a professional life in New York. She resumed her salon. Can you talk about that and what that was like? And also, I know this is two questions again. Did she speak publicly about her experiences? So it's really two very different questions, I know, but they're coming from the same questioner.
Well, in terms of her job, she had a much easier time than my father did. My father basically didn't speak any English. He was 44 years old when he came to the United States. They didn't want to come to the United States. They wanted to stay in Prague. They came not because of the war, they came because of the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1948. So that they spent 45 to 48 in Prague. They were very happy. They had a beautiful apartment at the foot of Wenceslas Square. My mother had her salon there. I was born there. And in February of 1948, the communists took over and my father said, the communists are Nazis in a different color uniform and we're not staying here. So they left with no money. And it was a disaster for my father because my father spoke no English at all. He was a water polo coach. The only place they played water polo in New York City was the New York Athletic Club on Central Park South, and it was restricted to Jews. So there was absolutely no question of getting a job there. I don't believe Columbia had a water polo team at the time, but at any rate, he didn't get a job there either. So he was unemployed pretty much for 10 years of my life. So it fell to my mother to make a living, and luckily there had been a lot of Czech refugees who had come to New York before they had arrived. And one of them was a soprano at the Metropolitan Opera named Jarmila Novotná. And Jarmila became her first customer. And then through the Metropolitan Opera, she got a lot of other customers. And my mother basically supported the family for the first 10 years that we were in the United States. So I had a very modern American feminist upbringing, but it was very hard on my mother because, of course, my father wasn't a house husband and she had not only a business to run, but a family to raise and a household to run. So it was difficult. So that was that. And the second question was what?
Did she speak publicly about her experiences?
Not initially because no one asked, but eventually, yes.
And how did she feel about that? Did she feel that she was, educating people? Did she like speaking about it? Did she feel it was a duty?
All of the above. I think that she didn't get out on the circuit. She didn't have an ego. My mother was really an artist. My mother loved to make clothes. That was her thing was, and she did it all her life. I think doing speaking engagements or writing books was definitely a far off second place to making clothes.
Interesting. So several people want to know, if you could ask your mother anything today, what would you ask her?
Oh, I really don't know what I would ask her. I really don't know what I would ask her. I mean, I would ask her about things that are too private to ask on Zoom.
So your mother's memoir ends in a very interesting place. It ends on New Year's Day, 1946. She's shushing down a mountain in Slovakia. Why did she stop her story there? What do you think she was trying to say, and what meaning do you attribute to that?
My mother came from a very suicidal family. Both of my grandparents were suicidal. My great-grandmother did commit suicide. She jumped out a window in Vienna in 1891. And my mother had a very, very melancholy streak in her. Even without the war, she would have been struggling with suicide. And over Christmas of 1945, she had come back to Prague alone. She hadn't met my father yet. She was basically sleeping in empty apartment. She was couch surfing. She had no possessions. She was finding it extremely difficult to get her papers back, any kind of papers, private papers, public papers, her salon papers. She was getting all kinds of offers from people she didn't want to be getting offers from. One of the policemen at Terezin, who had known her husband, offered to marry her. Some customers of her mother's offered to adopt her. At this point, she was 25 years old. She didn't want to be adopted by anybody, but she was desperately lonely. Kitty, who was her closest friend, had basically become this party girl again, and was just going from party to party. And my mother was much too serious for that kind of thing. And so on that Christmas of 1945, she went down to the river, Prague, there's a river that goes through it. And at the end of December, that river is pretty icy. And she wound up being intercepted by another Czech policeman who said, "Lady, you should not be out here." And he escorted her to where she was then staying. And one of the few possessions that had been returned to her were a pair of skis, her own pair of skis and her own boots. And so the following day, when she woke up and realized that she hadn't killed herself and that it was going to be a new year, she decided she was going to go skiing. And I think that's what saved her then. And I think for her, skiing really means life. She was, like many Czech people, she was an avid sportswoman. My father was a swimmer. He wasn't a skier, but they both skied in the end because that was one of the things you do. And my brothers are both skiers, and some of Franci's grandchildren are skiers. So that's quite a life symbol for all of them.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I think we have time for two more questions. So one question that I'd like to ask is, your mother was asked about her feelings toward the Germans, and she says that she hate is a sentiment I can ill afford, since it ultimately leads to hatred of oneself. But she also says, every German older than me decidedly makes me uncomfortable, as if the blood of my dead companions were still on his hands. Did you see this openness, yet this discomfort when you were growing up, and how did it influence your view of the world and of Germans and Nazis and this, going out into a world full of people different from yourself?
Well, I had a very unusual bringing up in the sense that my mother worked at home. Her salon was at home. So not only was I exposed to all the people who worked for her seamstresses, her forelady, her cleaning lady, we had like 5 people in the house every day, but then there were all her customers, okay? And some of these people were German. And some of these people were German Jews, and some of these people were German non-Jews. For example, our cleaning lady, Mrs. Holzner, was a German woman, non-Jewish, who had come to the United States in the early 1930s, who was absolutely devoted to my mother, and my mother was devoted to her. And my mother had this idea, like many Czechs do, that Germans have some supernatural way of cleaning, that Czechs don't, and certainly, Americans don't. So she always had to have a German cleaning lady. And in fact, she only had Mrs. Holzner. Mrs. Holzner was always our cleaning lady. The other person who was in our house all the time was her forelady, the person who supervised, her assistant, whose name was Honey. And Honey was another German who was not Jewish. And so I grew up with Germans around, young, post-war Germans. And I was very used to them, not to speak of the customers. There were many customers who were indeterminate. You couldn't tell what they were. They were German, or they were Jewish, or they were Polish, or they were Hungarian. I mean, who knew what they were? But so that was, I grew up in a very cosmopolitan atmosphere, and also everybody spoke German and Czech and French and English. So I grew up hearing all that. Now, when it came to going to Germany myself, I didn't go until some of my books were published in Germany. And that was a very, very disorienting experience for me, because on the one hand, I felt like I needed to be open to post-war Germans because it wasn't their fault, right? They were born after the war. So why would I be feeling anything? But of course, you cannot go to Germany if you are a child of people whose grandparents were murdered by Germans and not be aware of it and not have an emotional reaction to it. So I've been to Germany maybe 3 or 4 times, and I have to say that I feel always a bit dissociated there. I never feel relaxed. I never feel like I'm myself. I feel badly about it. I feel that I wish I could be more relaxed. On the other hand, I always understand Black friends here in America who talk about, oh, please, give me a break. I don't want to be your Black person. Well, when I go to Germany, I don't want to be their Jew. I don't want to be bothered. I want to be left alone. And that very rarely happens.
Wow. There have been a lot of questions about the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia. Do you have any suggested books that people could read if they want to learn more about that part of World War II and that part of the world?
Probably the easiest thing would be to watch some movies. I would watch The Shop on Main Street. I would watch Closely Watched Trains. There are a whole bunch of movies that were made in the last 20 years. I can't remember their names right now. Some of them were made for television, but they're very, very good. I don't know. I'm trying to think what specifically, could somebody say specifically what they're looking for? Are they looking for history?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people have been, just asking in general. Somebody recommended The Last Palace. I'm not familiar with it, by Norma Eisen. But if there are any history books that you can think of, I don't want to put you on the spot. I just didn't know if you, maybe had something.
The one, if you're interested in women's history and history of Jews in Central Europe, I actually wrote one. My book, Where She Came From, is a very, very serious history book that goes from about 1800 to 1948. And it follows the Czech Jews. Again, I'm not the Slovak Jews, but the Czech Jews. So that's one book. There isn't a ton of stuff. Yeah, I don't know what else to recommend to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. Definitely look at those. Helen, I want to thank you for an absolutely amazing program and for sharing your mother's story. Really, it was fascinating, and I think we all learned so much. I'd like to once again thank our program supporters, Ellen Crane-Rosker, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Shabana and Parvez Khan, Faye Rosen, Lucinda and Sandy Rosen, and Malka and Gary Torgo for making this evening possible. Please visit our museum and explore our special exhibit, Operation Finale, The Capture and Trial of Adolf Eichmann, which is on display through October. And your support of the Holocaust Memorial Center is critical at this time. Please consider making a donation or becoming a member or upgrading to become a sustaining member. Our next event is tomorrow evening, and it's an advanced private screening of the animated short film about Dr. Ruth Westheimer's journey on the Kindertransport. We have a few spots left, and you may register on our website. There's also more information on upcoming events on our website, including our 36th anniversary benefit. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you very soon.